Jay, an aging veteran, lost in the quiet decay of Blue Springs, received a mysterious letter calling him back into service for a secret mission. Haunted by memories of Afghanistan and fallen comrades, he accepted the task without hesitation. After meeting the reserved agent Ben, Jay was led to an abandoned site where old ghosts and hidden agendas waited. Completing his final mission, Jay returned to the empty courthouse, submitted his resignation, and vanished into obscurity. Later, a silent plaque appeared in the hall, a tribute understood only by those who knew that true service leaves no loud legacy. If you feel respect for veterans, then write comments and watch the video to the end. Jay sat on the bench outside the old post office in Blue Springs, Missouri. The town had hardly changed. Places like this clung to memories, anchored to the land, and refused to rush with the rest of the world. The buildings had aged, but the people, just like before, hurried on to work, even if that work was nothing, more than a distraction from thinking about the future. He wasn't sure how much longer he would sit on this bench, the splintered, crooked boards creaking under him, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the kind of man who hurried anymore. At 68, with a heavy gaze and the faint smell of cigarettes and rain clinging to his old leather jacket, he was someone whose life no longer depended on what would happen tomorrow. A veteran, an officer, a man with a disability, his once prized military service was now a distant echo, forgotten by most, like so many others. He had become a part of what the system called the missing, the ones who had been overlooked, discarded, and left behind. The very system he had once fought to protect. His eyes were tired, but sharp. He watched as people passed him by, oblivious to his presence. He noticed how they moved, focused, oblivious, wrapped up in their own worlds. More and more it seemed that he too had become part of that insignificance, a shadow lingering over the town, rather than a part of it. It was as though he had been erased from the picture, forgotten. The years of service, the sacrifices, the experiences that shaped him, they no longer mattered. He wasn't sure if he was waiting for something, or if he had simply stopped waiting altogether. The familiar hum of the small town, the distant sound of cars, the murmur of morning chatter, the clink of coffee cups in the diner across the street, washed over him. Everything felt the same, but nothing felt real. His hand, worn from years of work, rested on his knee, and the cold autumn air tugged at the edge of his jacket. He watched the leaves dance in the breeze, aimless and unhurried, like him. People walked past him without a second glance. A few nodded absently, but it was the kind of nod that said they'd already forgotten who he was before they'd even passed him. It didn't bother him. It was just how things had become. He had come to accept it. The world had its own rhythm now, and Jay was no longer part of it. The noise of the town, the chatter, the hurried steps, he didn't belong to any of it. He was a ghost in a place where he had once mattered. It had been a long time since anyone had asked about him, and even longer since he had felt like his presence made a difference. Blue Springs was small, and in a small town, people moved on quickly. They didn't forget, but they didn't hold on either. They had their own lives, their own struggles. Jay's story had long since faded into the background. There was no longer anyone who needed to remember the soldier, the officer, the man, who had stood at the front lines, who had watched comrades fall beside him, who had known the burden of carrying too much weight. That man didn't exist anymore. His body had aged. The hard edges of youth had softened into the sagging lines of time. His back ached from years of carrying not just the physical toll of his service, but the invisible weight of what he had left behind. The uniform that had once been so sharp, so crisp, now felt like a relic, a shadow of something that had been. He felt disconnected from the life he had once known, from the person he had once been. But there, on that bench, in the middle of this small, unchanged town, Jay found himself rooted, just like the town itself. He had no direction, no purpose, just a place where time passed and people lived their ordinary lives, ignoring the extraordinary lives of those who had faded away. He let out a breath, one that seemed to have been held in for years, the kind of sigh that didn't ask for anything, but just acknowledged the weight of everything that had come before. It was the kind of breath that told him he had lived his life, and now he was waiting for the next chapter to unfold, if there was even one left to unfold. A few days later, something new appeared in Jay's life. It was a letter, his first in a long time. It arrived without a return address, the envelope white and slightly crumpled, as though it had traveled from far away. He opened it without hesitation, his fingers moving with an instinctive familiarity, and began to read. The letter was from a stranger, yet it stirred something deep within him. It spoke of a job, one Jay had tried for years to forget. The letter detailed a mission, an operation so secretive, its specifics were locked away in the deepest of archives. But Jay knew this was no accident. They wanted him back. He was needed. He read the words. Something shifted in him, something he hadn't felt in years. His body, which had long since given up on ever being part of something important again, seemed to stir. The old, faded energy that had once propelled him through countless operations, that had kept him moving forward, despite all odds, flickered back to life. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the paper over, as though checking for more information, for anything else he might have missed. But there was nothing more. The letter was brief, yet its message was clear. A call to return, to step back into the shadows of a life he had left behind. The words on the paper were heavy. They spoke of duty, of missions that could not be ignored, of an undeniable need for someone with his skills. They called him to action once again. The time for sitting quietly in the corner of a forgotten town had passed. There was still work to be done, and he was the one they wanted. As Jay let the letter slip from his hands, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. His mind was flooded with memories, years of service, of battles fought and comrades lost, of choices made in the heat of the moment that had shaped the course of his life. He had lived with the weight of those decisions for so long, trying to reconcile them with the man he had become. And now, this letter had reopened that door, pulling him back into a world he had left behind. For a moment, Jay sat still, the letter resting on the table in front of him. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of the paper in his hands, the creak of the old chair beneath him. He felt the pull, a tug deep in his chest, the familiar calling of something larger than himself. He had been a soldier, an officer once. He had been part of something that mattered, but those days were long gone, and he had resigned himself to the quiet life he had built, to the anonymity of Blue Springs. Yet now this letter had awakened something inside him that he thought he had buried, a sense of purpose, of duty, of the soldier who had once believed in something greater than the sum of his own existence. Jay stood up slowly, his joints creaking in protest, the weight of years settling heavily on his shoulders. He walked to the window, staring out at the small town, at the mundane movements of life that continued on without him. The world outside was unchanged, but inside him everything felt different. The silence in his home seemed louder now, more oppressive. He wasn't sure what to do with the feelings swirling inside him, the sudden urge to act, to return to a life he had tried so hard to forget. The letter had left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't turn away from it. The part of him that had once thrived on action, that had once believed in fighting for something bigger, had been awakened. The question now was whether he still had the strength to answer that call. Jay folded the letter carefully, his hand steady despite the turmoil inside him. He placed it back in the envelope and walked to the table by the door where a faded map of the country lay. His fingers brushed over the surface of the map, tracing the lines of places he had been, places he would never forget. Then he closed his eyes for a moment, as if steeling himself for what he knew was coming. There was no turning back. The weight of his decision hung in the air, heavy with the promise of what might lie ahead. Whatever path he chose, it would take him into the shadows of his past once more. And something told him that once he stepped back into that world, it would never let him go again. Jay sat motionless for hours, the silence around him deepening as the world outside continued to move, unaware of the turmoil inside him. His thoughts drifted back, as they often did, to the distant deserts of Afghanistan, endless sands, the oppressive heat, and the constant weight of survival. The memory of those years was etched deeply into him, more vivid than the present, more real than the quiet life he had tried to build. He remembered the man he had once been, young, full of strength, unshaken by fear. He had been eager to prove himself, to dive headfirst into the most dangerous situations. He had believed in something bigger than himself, in the mission, in the comrades by his side. His brothers in arms had shared that belief, the sense of purpose that came with each operation, each dangerous step they took together. They had been a unit, a force stronger than the sum of its parts, bound by a shared conviction. But that was a lifetime ago. Time had a way of eroding everything: people, ideals, even memories. His team had been scattered, some lost to the unforgiving desert, others fading into the shadows of time. They had fought, had bled, and had died for causes that the world would soon forget, and Jay had been left behind, scarred, haunted by the faces of the men who would never come home. He had returned, not a hero, but a survivor, and in the years that followed, he had tried to bury those memories deep, away from the light of day. He had chosen to fade into the background, to become just another forgotten soul, living in the shadows of a world that had no place for the broken. But the memories, they never truly left him. They lingered, not like whispers in the dark, but as constant companions, reminders of a time when he had been part of something important, something real. They were there every time he closed his eyes, every time the wind howled through the trees outside his small home, carrying with it the echoes of a life he could never escape. The heat of the desert, the smell of dust and gunpowder, the weight of the rifle in his hands, these things had become a part of him, not unlike the scars on his body, reminders of battles fought long ago. Jay had never been able to shake the feeling that something was missing, something vital that had been taken from him. He had tried to move on, to forget, but it was impossible. It was as if the war had become part of his blood, and no matter how far he ran, it would always follow him. The friends he had lost, the choices he had made, the things he had seen, they had shaped him in ways he could never explain to anyone. They had shaped him in ways he could never escape. As the hours passed, Jay felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He couldn't return to the life he had once known. That much was clear. The years of solitude, of fading into obscurity, had taken their toll. But this new mission, this call to action, it was different. It was his chance to make things right, to do something meaningful again. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose, a spark of the man he had once been. He had buried that part of himself, locked it away in a box he never thought he would open again. But now it was pushing its way back to the surface, demanding to be heard. There was still work to be done, still a debt to be paid. This mission, whatever it was, could be his redemption. It was the chance he had been waiting for without even knowing it. Jay closed his eyes, the memories flooding back in a wave. The faces of his fallen comrades, the weight of their loss still fresh in his mind. Even after all these years, he had never asked for redemption, never expected it. But now, with the letter in his hand, with the decision weighing heavy on his heart, he knew that this was his moment to finally put the ghosts of the past to rest. The past could never be erased, and the scars would never fade. But perhaps, just perhaps, this final mission could bring him peace, a peace he had long since given up on finding. With a deep breath, Jay stood up, the creaking of his joints sounding louder in the quiet room than the memories in his mind. It was time to stop running, time to face whatever came next, time to honor those who had been lost, and in doing so, find a way to honor himself. The next day, Jay received a phone call. The voice on the other end was deep, steady, and controlled, much like his own. The man introduced himself as Agent Ben. His tone was calm, but there was an underlying certainty. In his words, a sense of quiet authority that immediately put Jay on alert. Ben didn't waste time with pleasantries or idle questions. He didn't ask about Jay's past, his experiences, or his history. Instead, he got straight to the point, speaking of a mission that needed a man who could still stand tall, despite the years, despite the burdens of time and age. The task was clear, time had come, and Jay was needed. Jay listened, absorbing the details, though there weren't many. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was that the mission was real, and it was his last chance to be part of something important again. His body, worn from years of wear and tear, responded to the call. A small part of him that had lain dormant for years stirred, something that felt familiar and unsettling in equal measure. It had been a long time since he had been asked to do anything of real significance. He had spent too many years on the sidelines, watching life go on without him, a spectator in his own existence. But this was something different. The mission was his final chance. He couldn't refuse. Jay didn't question the details. He didn't ask what would be expected of him, where he was headed, or what dangers lay ahead. He knew the price of asking. Too many questions. Some things were better left unknown. All he knew was that he had been given a purpose again, even if that purpose was shrouded in uncertainty. The mission would take him into a world he thought he had left behind, a world of shadows and risks and decisions that no one would ever know about. 2 days later, Jay found himself in a car, driving towards an unknown destination with Agent Ben at the wheel. The road stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the quiet landscape. The car hummed steadily, its tires turning over the miles as the world outside remained unchanged. Jay sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, though he wasn't really seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a time when the world had been much more immediate, when every decision carried life or death consequences. The mission was drawing closer. The fear that had once been so familiar, so constant, began to creep back in. It was a feeling Jay had learned to suppress over the years, but it was there now, just beneath the surface. The war had long since been over for him, but the echoes of it remained reverberating in the corners of his mind. Those old instincts, those long-buried skills, were slowly waking up. And, with them, the ghosts of the past, the faces of men he had lost, the memories of missions that had never been acknowledged, that had never seen the light of day. Jay didn't ask Ben any questions. The agent had told him enough, and Jay wasn't interested in knowing more. He understood the unspoken rule. You do the job, you don't ask why. Asking questions only led to complications, to risks. The less you knew, the better. In this world of covert operations, information was currency, and the less you had, the safer you were. As the car sped on, the distance between him and the familiar life he had known began to widen. He was leaving behind the quiet routine of Booth Springs, the town that had been his refuge for so many years, and heading into something far more dangerous, far more uncertain. But in some strange way, it felt right. It felt like stepping back into a role he had long since left behind, a role he had never truly wanted to abandon. They drove in silence, the weight of what was to come settling over Jay. The world outside seemed to grow more distant, more detached, as if the car was traveling through a space of its own, separate from the world it passed through. The roads blurred, the buildings faded, and all that mattered now was the mission ahead. The place where Jay was brought was empty, abandoned. It was located in a remote area, and from the moment he stepped out of the car, he felt the heaviness of the air, a weight that told him this wasn't just another assignment. The building in front of him, a dilapidated structure long forgotten by time, seemed to breathe the same eerie silence that had once surrounded him in the field. It was a place that held memories of distant places, Afghanistan, the desert, the mountains, places where orders were given, and they were followed without question. But here, in this forgotten corner of the world, Jay understood that something was different. Something larger loomed behind the operation. But there was no turning back now. He was already here, and there was no time to second-guess his choices. As he moved through the building, the floorboards creaked under his weight, the faint smell of dust and old concrete lingering in the air. The atmosphere was thick with tension, something Jay hadn't felt in a long time. He remembered the early days of his service when every mission felt like it held the world in its balance, but now those feelings seemed foreign, as though they belonged to another man, another life. A few men in uniform greeted him as he entered, their faces obscured by masks or the shadows of the dimly lit room. There was no need for introductions. The faces he saw were unrecognizable, even though some of them were hauntingly familiar. They were ghosts from a time when he had been someone else, a younger man, a soldier, full of fire and purpose. But now they seemed more like strangers to him. He had become a ghost, too, one who had lived for so long outside the battlefield that the line between who he was and who he had been blurred. Jay moved silently, his eyes scanning the room, his mind already calculating the next steps. The operation had begun, but this was not a simple mission. This felt like the culmination of everything he had ever done, everything he had ever fought for. He could feel the old instincts rising again, pushing back the weariness of age. His body had grown old, scarred by time and conflict, but his mind, sharp and calculating, was still as quick as it had ever been. The men around him were a reminder of what he had left behind. They, too, were veterans like him, hardened by years of fighting, their faces a map of their experiences, their eyes empty of the hope they had once carried. They didn't need to speak. Their silence said everything. Jay was no longer part of the world he had once known. The camaraderie, the sense of belonging was gone. Now he was an outsider, much like the others, bound to an operation that no one could ever talk about, no one could ever share. But even as the weight of his past pressed down on him, Jay knew he couldn't back out now. He couldn't let the past define him or make him hesitate. His decision had already been made. He had come here for a reason, and that reason was bigger than anything he had done before. The memories of the past, the lost friends, the scars, the failures, began to swirl in his mind, but he pushed them down, focusing on the task at hand. His body ached as he moved deeper into the building, but his spirit remained strong. He was not the man he had been 30 years ago, but there was a fire inside him, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by age or time. This was his moment, his return to a world he had left behind, and he would not allow himself to falter. Despite the overwhelming sense of conflict that swirled around him, Jay understood one thing: this mission was his final chance to make things right. There were no more second chances. He had to give everything he had one last time. As he stood there, taking in the faces of the men around him, Jay knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be obstacles, challenges, and moments when the weight of his past would threaten to pull him under. But he was ready. He had fought battles before, and he would fight again. This was his chance to be part of something that mattered, to finally make a difference, even if it meant stepping back into the darkness he had once known. The conflict inside him was real, but it was nothing compared to the resolve that had hardened over a lifetime of fighting for something greater than himself. And so Jay moved forward, knowing that the war he had fought for so long ago was not truly over. It was simply taking a new form, and he was ready to face it. The next day after the mission had been completed, Jay returned. He didn't say a word. He simply exited the car and started walking toward the old courthouse in Blue Springs. The journey wasn't long, but with each step, his body groaned in quiet protest, the weight of the past pressing on him with every movement. His legs felt heavier than they had the day before, as though each footfall carried not just his own weight, but the memories of everything he had ever done. The courthouse loomed in front of him, its weathered facade a silent reminder of the passage of time. It stood there, unchanged, as if waiting for him to fulfill his final duty. Jay walked through the doors, the familiar scent of wood and old paper filling the air. The courtroom was empty, save for the dust motes that danced in the beams of sunlight. Streaming through the high windows, the floorboards creaked under his boots as he crossed the room, the silence amplifying with every step. It was the kind of silence that filled a person with something deeper than peace, something that felt like the end of a chapter, a story coming to a close. In his hands he held a single piece of paper, his resignation. It was simple, unassuming, but it carried with it the weight of a life lived, a life that had reached its conclusion. This piece of paper was a symbol, the final act in a long history of service. It was not just a resignation from his post, but from everything that had brought him here, from the man he had once been to the man who now stood alone at the end of his journey. He placed the resignation letter on the desk with a quiet certainty, not looking for approval, not expecting any recognition. It wasn't necessary. Jay knew his actions would speak for themselves, just as they had always done. He didn't need to stay. There was no need for farewells, no need for anyone to acknowledge his departure. He had done what was required of him, and now it was over. The mission had been completed. The debts had been paid. It was time to go. Without a second glance at the empty room, Jay turned and walked out. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, but the sound quickly faded, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the courthouse. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. There was nothing left for him here. That same day, in the early hours of the morning, a small plaque appeared in the courthouse hallway. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. It was just there, as quietly as everything else in the town. The brass letters caught the first light of day, but no one spoke of it. No one acknowledged its presence. It simply stood there, a silent marker, a testament to those who had served without expectation of recognition, who had given their lives in ways no one would ever truly understand. Perhaps only one person, Jay, truly understood its meaning. And maybe there was someone else, somewhere, who would come to recognize it too. But for now, the plaque remained, a reminder that some stories are never told, not in records, not in medals, not in headlines. Some stories are written in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the moments that the world sleeps through, unaware of the sacrifices made to keep it safe. Jay had served. He had done what was asked of him, and now, as a man once again slipping into the shadows, he walked away, leaving only that silent tribute behind.